We are continuing in Acts chapter 7. Last week we finished up the covenant with Adam. Why are covenants important? Why is seeing a flow throughout the Bible important? Because it solidifies God's plan. God has had a plan from the beginning. And unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they take the Bible for bits and pieces here and there, a chunk here, a chunk there. There's no real flow to it. And so when we look at the continuity of what God has wanted to do, we see the Bible into these covenants. We see these agreements that God has made throughout time. And these agreements all point to Christ and the ultimate covenant. Remember, the word covenant is also, it's an agreement, but it's also testament. So the Bible's split up into Old Covenant and New Covenant. Those are the two sections, Old Testament and New Testament. And so the covenants are important. It's an angle or a way to look at the Bible, to step back and see God's plan. God didn't just randomly sort of adjust as things happened. God had a plan from the beginning, and that included these agreements or covenants or working with certain people. So Stephen knew that as we go to Acts chapter 7. Let's go over there before we get into Genesis. Acts chapter 7. He knew this. This was their Jewish history. Stephen knew this as a Jew. He knew the background. He knew these covenants. He knew the different patriarchs, the different people that were involved in all of this. And remember, he's talking to the Jewish leadership. So they know. These guys are the religious leaders. They knew Torah inside and out. They understood this. But remember the one twist that Stephen's going to do. He's going to blame them for never paying attention to the plan of God. Following after idols, falling for deception, following after what Satan has wanted them to do, which is to fall away, get out of covenant with God by disobeying him. We're going to look at that, not this one, but the next one, where God lays out, I believe it's Deuteronomy 28, the blessings if they obey, and it's 14 verses long. And the cursings if they disobey, which I believe is like 50-something verses long. God knew what was going to happen. He knew that they were going to disobey. But God had a plan of redemption. We're going to see that. Keep that word in mind. We talked about it Sunday. It all should be weaving together. The importance of who we are under covenant with God and the plan of redemption. Redeeming people to be a part of God's plan. We talked about Peter, we talked about Paul, we talked about people in the Bible, how honest the Bible is as far as how these people overcame their own mistakes for God to use them. As we talked about, look up Matthew 1. We have Rahab, a Gentile harlot who's in the line of Christ. God can use people to bring about his plan. And so as we look at this, the Bible is a covenant book. It's a book of covenants, agreements with man that God has done, starting with Adam. And so Yahweh added another dimension. Once they sinned and fell, he added a different dimension. He pronounced, mind your way, Sister Patty. He pronounced his plan for the full redemption and restoration. Now I call them image bearers. Why? Because they're made in his likeness and image, right? God didn't breathe Holy Spirit into kangaroos. He breathed his spirit and likeness and created man in his likeness. Let us make man in our image and our likeness. And so we see that his plan for full redemption and restoration of his image bearers and their royal, priestly, and prophetic roles with their attendant privileges and responsibilities. So he's going to lay it out for them. He revealed how this was to be done by adding to his creation covenant the redemptive and restorative promises and implied stipulations of faith and obedience. Okay? Remember, sin has entered. And so the relationship that God had with man is he desired to create a relationship with a created entity made in his image. Sin has caused the gulf in between God and man. And so God has to have a plan for man to get back into God's good graces, a plan of redemption. Okay? He established what has been widely known as the covenant of grace. And we see that through Christ. That's the other twist. Not only telling the Jewish leadership that their entire generation after generation after generation had messed up and had disobeyed God, but also everything they knew pointed to the Messiah, not a still coming Messiah, an already come Messiah who they killed. Okay? So that's the difference. That's who Stephen links him to. So he makes a covenant with Noah. Now, Genesis 6 through 9 presents Noah as a faithful covenant man. We see this in the book of Genesis, chapter 6. It talks about he was faithful, he was obedient. In the midst of a very sinful, corrupt society, which God had determined to wipe out, Noah lived obediently. So if you can see Genesis chapter 6. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, of whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And so God is, if you go down to verse 5, Then the Lord saw that the wickedness, because that 1 through 5 is 1 through 4 is a whole nother lesson. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Now, one thing about the Bible, as we've talked about, the Bible puts words in there on purpose. In the original Hebrew and in the translation, the words are in there on purpose. Now, the idea for this is to show how evil man had truly gotten. So look at these adjectives as we read them. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man, which means the Lord is still keeping an eye on man, even years later, that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, meaning that had grown, that had mushroomed, that had expanded, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. You couldn't add any more adjectives to that. I mean, you couldn't, if you wanted to make a point, there it is, okay? What do we see as a correlation? Let's pause real quick and let's go to Matthew 24. When I say Matthew 24, we should know, and we'll get there. We'll, if you don't know it already, we'll get there. We should know what Matthew 24 is. Okay? Matthew 24 is a great place to go to see the condition of man prior to Christ's return. So in verse 37, what does Jesus say in Matthew 24:37? But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, as also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So in the days of Noah, we're seeing a general disgust, a general dislike, a general evil in their hearts continually. What Jesus says about the times of the end, that they're going to be like those days of Noah. That they're eating, they're drinking, they're marrying, they're just sort of living life, sort of apathetic toward God. That turns to against God. So if they're doing evil in their heart continually, they're just not thinking about God. They're pursuing evil in their heart. If every intent of their heart was evil continually, then that tells you what the condition was. Jesus parlays that to the days of Noah. He says that it's going to be the same. And in the same unexpected manner, people will be caught off guard. Now, does that mean that Jesus could come back any minute and everyone will be off guard? No. All right. Imminent return. No, that is not the case. Okay. There will be signs and wonders and things will have to happen before Jesus returns. Noah built the ark 120 years. There was plenty of time because he's preaching and building. Multi-talented guy, Noah. Building and preaching and sharing and telling people about the things of God. And they're just ignoring him. Well, what does that sound like? Sounds like our efforts today, doesn't it? We're preaching and building and showing people that, hey, there's something coming. Like the second coming of Christ is going to happen and you're not going to be ready. Noah's case, the flood is coming and you're not going to be ready. Like, start to believe. Stop with the evil continually. And they, crazy old guy building a boat. No one even knows what rain is. It had never rained before. No one knows what rain is. So same thing. Jesus is an afterthought, unfortunately, and so is his work. In the midst of a very sinful, corrupt society, which God determined to wipe out, Noah lived obediently. Socially, he had one wife, 3 sons. He was blameless so that others cannot accuse him of wrongdoing. Back in chapter 6 of Genesis, and verse 6, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man, beast, creeping thing, birds, for I'm sorry that I have made them. How crazy is that? God was sorry that he made mankind. And how bad do we have to be? It's about every couple thousand years God intervenes. The flood, about a couple thousand years later. Christ, about a couple thousand years later, will be the return. Right? God just sort of has enough. And that's what we see here. But in verse 8, Noah found grace in the eyes of God. Okay? But what about the law and what about the church? All of that would come. In what God had established as correct worship, Noah was doing it in the same way that Abel was doing correct worship prior to all of that. And God was pleased with Abel and not pleased with Cain. And so God disregarded Cain's sacrifice and offering and worship and approved of Abel's. So God sees that Noah was somebody who was faithful. Verse 9, this is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. So we see a difference. God looks down and sees Noah versus everybody else. Because in verse 11, the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Oh my goodness. Jesus couldn't have nailed it any better than saying in the days of Noah. Verse 12, so God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Made me think of mine and Brother Derek's conversation. Corruption is all throughout the earth. Corruption is at high levels and low levels. There's people just following other people. There's just so much corruption. It has permeated everything. And so we see that in the times of Noah. Jesus compares the two. Spiritually, he was in constant fellowship with God. He walked with God, was righteous. He lived according to God's will. When commanded to build the ark, he proved to be a capable servant. He was able to do it. Right? He had the, what do we say in basketball back in the day? He had skios, right? He had the ability to build an ark. He didn't hire someone who would hit his thumb with a hammer. That's why I'm glad I wasn't there. The ark would have never been built. Yahweh assured Noah that his covenant of creation and its connected covenant of gracious redemption and restoration would be maintained with him and his family. We see that in verse 18. As God speaks to Noah, he says, but I will establish my covenant with you And you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your son's wife with you. 8 people. Population, Earth's population, 8. Not 8 billion as it is today. 8 after this was all said and done. But notice what God says. My covenant, my agreement, I will establish a pact, an agreement with you, a covenant with you, Noah. After the flood had removed a corrupt society and then receded, Noah, the covenant man, worshiped. He built an altar and sacrificed. Yahweh responded to Noah's worship and determined to continue his relationship with the cosmos. We see this in 8:20 verses 9 through 9:17, where God sees what Noah is doing and approves of the worship, has covenanted with Noah, and says that I will continue in this relationship. However, parts of the creation covenant mandates were repeated. Some were clarified. In confirming his creation covenant with humanity, God said that every living creature was included. God included the death penalty for murder and meat as legitimate food for humanity. We see this in Genesis 9. Please go look at this. That's why I have scripture addresses here. This is fantastic stuff. God had to change. The earth was very different prior to the flood. Okay? Some people think God sent an asteroid and it burst the pocket around the earth, and that's what caused it to rain, and then he broke up the deeps. However God did it, doesn't matter. God clearly broke up the waters from underneath the earth and caused everything to flood. Why do they find fossils on top of mountains? Why do they find aquatic fossils on top of mountains? Okay, the entire planet was covered in water. And so it's not that difficult or far-fetched to find a fish skeleton fossil on the top of a very high mountain. Okay, and so we have talked about that Missoula used to be a lake. Everything used to be a lake. Okay, if you want to count it that way, everything was a lake because everything was covered. And so we see that, but God had to change a few things. But then this assurance, continuing or concerning the continuity of the creation covenant, includes the implication that God would continue his gracious and redemptive work. Okay? And he does that by continuing. This continuity would be worked out, particularly with Shem, blessed by Yahweh. Noah's 3 sons. Anyone? We just had it on Sunday. Not scalloped potatoes. There is not a son named scalloped potatoes. Ham, Shem, Japheth. That's right. So the continuity would continue with Shem, blessed by Yahweh, to serve as the builder of tents, that even Ham's offspring, Canaan, would enter. Japheth's offspring would benefit from it and enlarge it. Thus Yahweh, God, maintained and expounded his covenant with Noah and his offspring, because now everything's going to have to come from them. So everything's going to have to now proliferate, is that a word? Through them to continue. After God had given absolute assurance to Noah and his sons that the creation covenant would continue, there were not many direct references to it again. However, the presents are consistently and constantly present. So there may not be a lot of discussion about the covenant with Noah, but we do see the results of it. Well, how do we see that? Where is the covenant promised through Noah by God? There it is. There it is. Has anyone ever seen a rainbow? Okay. Has anyone ever seen a rainbow in the sky? Has anyone ever gone to the end of it and realized there's actually not gold there? Yeah, right here. Done it. God says in Genesis 9, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Now, God is going to rock the earth. We see that in the book of Revelation. We see God really rocking the earth, taking it like a snow globe. God's going to do that. We see in the book of Revelation where God uses the earth to open up and swallow the armies of Antichrist. So God is still in control of the earth. He's still in control. But the one thing that he won't do is he won't flood the earth again. So there's the remnants of the Noahic covenant that we still see today. So how many people love rainbows? Love rainbows. I'm a rainbow guy. Love the rainbow. Yes. I love Skittles, so I can taste the rainbow, which is great too. I love Skittles. You like Skittles, Sean? No? Okay. Okay, not your favorite. Okay. I'll bet there's some fantastic rainbows here. I'm looking forward to seeing one. Montana? No, they're fine. Rainbow is a rainbow. It doesn't matter. Very pretty. God's covenant. Whenever we see that, the first thing we should think of is the covenant God made with man and the promise he made to not flood the earth again, not anything else. So, we already kind of talked about the Tower of Babel. God makes the choice to break away from working with humanity as a whole and decides to single out one faithful man. So after all of this, Tower of Babel is in Genesis 10. We see God dealing with Abram starting at the end of 11, and then the covenant promises, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, which I believe was homework. No, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Okay. I forgot, so you're off the hook. From Abram, God would create the covenant blessings and funnel all promises through him and his family. 4 years in the making. Inch-thick cones. Okay? A huge hit at the association, by the way. You know, this Dave Barnum's kind of a rock star over there. Mike Maney's a bit of a rock star over there. They're doling out books like they're dealers. And so, fantastic book. I'm only through chapter 8, and there's a lot to it. But just know that this is the everlasting covenant. This affects us today, the Abrahamic covenant, a beautiful covenant. So we're going to study it because Stephen talks about it with the Sanhedrin. All right. Stephen knew this. He knew about Abraham. They all knew about Abraham and recounted it with the Sanhedrin, who also knew this. So Stephen knew the importance and everlasting covenant God had with Abraham. He knew the Father standing in front of him would know it inside and out. So why does he recap it? What's the point of recapping it? What's his end objective? What's he going to bring him to? What's he going to point him to? To lead them to Christ. To point them to the Messiah they were looking for. That they, in fact, had to repent as Jesus himself go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the unrepentant, the disobedient sheep of the house of Israel. Well, why Israel? Why Israel? Has anyone ever wondered that? Why Israel? Why do we care about Israel today? Why are we told to pray for the peace of Jerusalem? Why do we care so much about all of this? Because the covenant is through Abraham, the father of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, who had 12 sons, each of them a tribe. They all procreated and had tribes. So these groups became the nation of Israel. If you read the Old Testament, Genesis ends with Joseph, one of the 12. We're going to talk about him too. But then now when we get to Exodus, all of a sudden, they're no longer free in Egypt because Joseph was second in command to Pharaoh. But now they're enslaved in Egypt. And there's a guy named Moses who gets born. And so it all is just beautifully woven together. God's plan beautifully laid out. And so that's why we care about Israel, because Israel points to Christ. Let's look at how Stephen does this how he does this with this deeply religious group of leaders at the time. As a side note, I think we should be viewing Stephen's message as a witness, as a witnessing example. He knows he's got minutes to live. I think he had grace from God that he was going to preach no matter what happened. That should be us. We should be proclaiming the message of Christ no matter what happens. And they made fun of me. Okay. But they don't like me anymore. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We're about to see what happens to Stephen. I think as we study more and more of this, I hope that we get the sense as we weave this and Trail of Blood and all that together, that our witness is not optional. That the Great Commission was a command to go out and teach the nations. And so that's why we backtrack and study who we are, who we're attached to get all that squared away. It's purely for our witness. In witnessing, we meet people where they are, what they know, what's comfortable for them, and then lead them into the Lord's truth. Try talking about the Abrahamic covenant with an atheist. That's not meeting people where they are. They don't even believe in a higher power, let alone a plan that he has. So we have to meet people where they are. As we witness, assess people. What have you heard? What have you talked to them about? Where are they? Meet them where they are, lead them to Christ. Stephen could have pushed Jesus from the start, but the witnessing opportunity would not have been there. They would have closed their ears and rushed him sooner than they did, and the opportunity to teach would have been lost. So he allowed the Spirit to work and speak for Stephen and preach Jesus as Christ in both Testaments. Remember, he's connecting Old Testament to what had just happened. And so he's going to link them together in his message. So Yahweh, revealing himself as the sovereign one to Abram, gave him covenantal promises, spiritual well-being, making a great nation of him, and using him as the conduit or channel of blessings to all people. Yahweh added to the assurances of blessings the certainty of the curse on despisers and rejectors of Abram and his sovereign God. If you have enemies, they're enemies of me. Okay? The process of God's covenanting with Abram was unfolded throughout the course of Abram's life. Now, when Abram was afraid after his separation from and rescue from Lot, Yahweh assured Abram of his abiding presence and protection for him as a shield and the blessed spiritual future Yahweh had for him, which is great reward. We see this in Genesis 14 and 15. Okay? What does Abraham have to do with Christ? We're getting there. Okay? So important, these covenant blessings. So important to look at the Bible through this covenant lens. So this same protection that God gave to Abraham through covenant is the same protection he gives to his church through covenant. As an attachment to these covenants, God protects his ecclesia. Abram realized his great future included children, so he inquired about this. You're going to make me a great nation. That's fantastic. I have no kids. How does that work? What are we going to do? So, of course, he asks. Yahweh assured him he would have many. In this way, the continuity of the covenant was assured. Hey, you're good. Don't worry about anything. You follow me. I'll take care of the rest. That includes children. That includes me blessing you. An added promise was given that he would possess land. A covenant ratification ceremony was performed in a vision to Abram, in which the blessing of peace for Abram and a curse or punishment was pronounced on those who enslaved the covenantal seed. We see this in Genesis 15. Has anyone ever gone through Genesis? Studied it like this? Fascinating stuff. There's so much stuff here. There's so much good stuff because it all correlates to Christ. You can see Christ in all of it. And so we see Abraham blessed, promised, all of these things. So Genesis 15 includes these different elements of covenant. Yahweh's sovereign presence. I'll always be there. His assured rich future. I'm going to bless you. The continuity through much seed. I'll make you the father of many nations. Okay, you're going to be the starting point of this covenant through many nations. A place to live and serve amongst the nations. A curse on opponents of the blessed, meaning him and those who came after him. And the response of faith and blessing of justification. Justifying Abram's obedience to God that God was going to do for him. The covenanting process continued with Abram even after he sinfully followed Sarah's suggestion to take Hagar the Egyptian maid as a concubine. Has anyone ever done something where they maybe jumped ahead of God? And sometimes you maybe fall a little bit on your face. That happens. We've all done it. Abraham took the suggestion of his wife, who was older, and said, I can't provide you kids. One of my handmaids can. Here you go. And so in Genesis 16, we see this. So how does God play all this out? How does he play all this out? Well, Yahweh came to Abram and gave further clarification of the redemptive and restorative covenant within the context of the creational covenant. Yahweh presented himself as the invincible, powerful, and exalted God. He emphasized the stipulations of the covenant. Walk before me, remain in constant everyday spiritual fellowship, and be blameless. Live uprightly according to my will among your fellow men. Okay? You need to do that. Tighten up, Abraham. Tighten up with this plan. Implied in these stipulations was his awareness of Abram's lack of faith and obedience. See, what happens is when we jump ahead of God, then we're not relying on God. We're taking it over ourselves. We're taking control of the situation. We're taking control of what God has said, I'll take care of. We're jumping ahead. Abram jumped ahead. Abram panicked. We don't have kids. We've got to have kids. All these promises. God, I got it. And he jumped ahead. Okay? We can't do that. Now, that's a learned behavior. Nobody does that right off the bat. And if you do, it may not last long, because then if you've lived the life of control of your life, then it's hard to give control to God. Abraham struggled with that. And so in this idea, which he believed God, I'm with you. I get it. I'm there. But this one little part where if it dies with me, then that's it. The promises are over. We've got to have kids. Sarah's got this idea. Let's do it. Okay. Now, God's going to work with it. Doesn't God work? In the redemptiveness of man, the redemption of man. God's pretty quick on the fly. Let's not underestimate God to work with this. So even though he had lack of faith and obedience in his sovereign, exalted God, his sin of adultery with Hagar, Abram had sinned, but Yahweh graciously confirmed his covenant. The verb here is to give. The continuity of the covenant with Abram was a gift of Yahweh's grace. I'm giving you this covenant, he says. Abram responded in humility and worship. 17:3. I think this is the one I wanted to go to. I jumped the gun. Abram was 99 years old. Verse 1, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless, be perfect, be mature, be complete. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of many nations. So this agreement, God and Abraham, he's going to make him the father of many nations, but he needed to respond in humility. So then these elements were then repeated. Abraham was promised many offspring. They would form nations and give rise to kings. This emphasized repetition of seed was strongly affirmed by the change of his name to Abraham and the assurance that the covenant with his offspring was for all time. Both offspring would flourish. So if God says the plan is not going through this child that you have through adultery, then the plan has to go through someone else. Now, this is where we get into some controversy, because the firstborn of the two believes these promises belong to them. God says otherwise. But when you look at the doctrine or the study of the firstborn, which we'll go through at some point, this concept of the firstborn throughout the entire Bible is fascinating, including here and including in the end, in Revelation, when the term firstborn is used on a few different occasions. So we'll study that. But right now, we've got two different offsprings, two different sons. One who God said, I'll provide for you. One that Abraham jumped the gun on. And this is where we have two major factions. This is where they split. Okay. Does anyone remember the name of the first son born by Hagar? No, that's the second one born. No, that is Isaac's son. Ishmael, that is correct. Ishmael is the son born by Hagar, the first one born. So if we keep with that doctrine of the firstborn, not through the plan of God, but just the concept, then there's a large group of people who believe they are correct in being the descendants of Ishmael. That's why I have both continue today. If you pull up a news app right now on your telephones, there's currently a war going on between these two brothers. On October 7th, one brother attacked another. And now they're fighting each other. They've been fighting each other for thousands of years, even when they were kids. Okay, go back and read this. Ishmael's picking on Isaac when he's born. Picking on him. He's licking his hand and touching him with it or whatever he was doing to just annoy Isaac. Until finally, Hagar has to bounce. This life-love bond between Yahweh and Abraham and his seed was strongly affirmed by the promise that I will be your God and the God of your descendants. Yahweh, by these words, assured Abraham of his abiding presence, his availability, his sure help, his unfailing love, support, and comfort in all of life. Abraham was also assured that he would possess the land as God had promised. So let's stop right there. We'll continue with Abraham next week. Any questions on this? Oh, it's just getting good. Covenant book written by a covenant God to a covenant people. Okay? Our Bible is not just a book. It's a covenant book written by a covenant God to a covenant people. And so when we look at the Bible through this covenant lens, we see these agreements as God has redeemed man and deemed them righteous. If you want to know who the righteous ones are, Hebrews 11 is a great chapter to read on who the faithful were, who the ones who worshiped God above all else. It's called the Hall of Faith, and it's a great place to read. Guess who's in there? Abraham. Guess who's in Stephen's message in Acts 7? Abraham. Why? Because the Jews claimed Abraham, and they should have. He was the father of their nation. But Abraham was just a conduit to get to Christ. And that's what he's going to bring them to. Okay? So we'll keep studying Abraham. It's a little bit more on this, and then we'll just keep moving into Stephen's message a little bit further.